Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the last session of PPX 2021. It's my pleasure to introduce to you John Kamensky, recently retired fellow from the IBM Center for the Business of Government in Washington, D.C. When John was there, he has edited or co-authored 8 books and writes and extensively speaks on leadership, organizational performance measurement, collaborative governance, and government reforms. During his 24 years of public service, he's had a very significant role in pioneering U.S. federal government performance and results orientation. He's very passionate about results orientation, performance-based, customer-focused, and collaborative approaches. Prior to 2001, Mr. Kamensky served for 8 years as Deputy Director of Vice President Gore's National Partnership for Reinventing Government. And before that, he worked at the U.S. Government Accountability Office for 16 years, where he played a key role in the development and passage of the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. And there'll be more about that later during our Q&A session. So it's my pleasure to welcome John to our PPX conference, and over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Allison. It's a real privilege to be able to join you all here today. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some insights and maybe have a dialogue with you about the evolution and future of performance, evidence, and the use of behavioral science in government. Back in 1992, I visited Ottawa when I was with the Government Accountability Office while I was doing research for the Congress about the development of a federal performance system. And I learned about your performance measurement approaches. And it helped me as we wound up helping design a system for the US. We found a lot of inspiration and encouragement, and that resulted in what's now called the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. I think that when you are able to see another country's performance system, it creates a sense of like possibilities and ideas. And I'm hoping that that's what I'll be able to do for you today. Just last month, I was attending a conference sponsored by the American Society for Public Administration, and Patricia Scotland, who's the Secretary General for the Commonwealth Secretariat, helped sponsor a global session on the progress of performance management. And again, I found it really useful and inspiring to learn and see about other countries' experiences. So that's my hope for today's session here. Before I get started, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the IBM Center, where I worked for about 20 years. It's a small think tank that's sponsored by IBM, and it's treated like a nonprofit. And what the idea is to connect practitioners and academics around original thinking on public management. So it's not policy, it's on management stuff. So it sponsors research by academics that result in reports. We'll do podcasts with current government leaders, typically US, but also sometimes internationally. And then it'll put together a magazine a couple times a year. And that magazine is distributed to all the career senior executives in the US federal government. And it's a way for them to see what their peers are doing, and it includes things from the radio broadcasts. They've issued about 400 reports over the past few years, and probably about 500 radio interviews, and they're all on its website, and I'll have the web link at the end of my slide presentation here. So what I want to do over the next 20 minutes or so is provide an overview of the US trends, and I'm calling them movements. The US performance movement that is encapsulated in law has largely matured, and there's still needs to be penetrated down to lower levels in organizations, but it's largely matured as a framework. The second movement I call it is what we call data analytics and evidence-based policy making movement. And that's what's sort of now just catching fire. And there's recent legislation around that. And this ties back and reinforces a lot of what's gone on in the performance movement. And then something that's sort of on the cusp of developing, and this is in the US, developing and in recent means like over the past 5 to 7 years. And this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about as I think intriguing approach that is a different policy tool than regulations or grants or mechanisms like contracts and stuff. So this is a new kind of tool for public administrators to use. Each of these different movements appeals to different kinds of users at different points in the policy and implementation process. And so that's where really trying to get them to work together to create some sort of alignment, I think, is going to be the challenge in coming years. What I'd like to do is start with the oldest movement, the performance movement. It's evolved over the past 30 years in the US federal government. And what I want to talk about is how that evolution's occurred, where the federal government is now, and then sort of a little bit about what's going on at the state and local levels. The federal level, the 1993 law that I wound up helping draft and was inspired by visits to countries such as Canada and Australia, New Zealand, other Commonwealth countries. That law requires agency level strategic plans that are multi-year, an annual performance plan or operating plan, and then measures and annual reports. And so that's created in a way a supply of information. What happened is in the next wave, when the Bush administration came in, they felt that having a supply didn't necessarily mean that the information was being used. And so they tried to create some incentives for the use of information. So they sort of shifted the unit of analysis from agencies down to programs. And so they did an assessment, what they call a program assessment rating tool, and rated every program in the government. And how they defined programs was idiosyncratic, but there were about 1,000 programs, and they analyzed about 200 a year over a 5-year period, and were using this information to inform budget decisions. So it wasn't driving budget decisions, but it was an informing budget decision. So the idea is, well, how do you shift from supply to demand? And when the Obama administration came in, they said, this is just too much paperwork and it's not really being used to drive decisions. Let's decongest the system. And so they said, let's just focus on a small handful of 3 or 4 priorities that an agency head cares about in each agency, and then some that are cross government-wide, which they wound up calling cross-agency priority goals. And that approach wound up being enshrined in legislation. It was called the Government Performance and Results Act Modernization Act in 2010. So there's been about a decade of maturation of that system. That process, or that law, wound up taking things that have been learned over the previous decade or so and putting them into law. So it was creating new positions in each agency, what they call performance improvement officers. And those performance improvement officers oversaw the performance systems within their agencies. And they also designated the deputy secretaries, which are political in our system, as the chief operating officers. So it's be like your deputy ministers. These would be deputy secretaries designated as chief operating officers. They would meet together to work on common objectives through the President's Management Council. So there's a system that developed for governing the performance management of the federal government. Again, there was an emphasis on how do we ensure that this information is used and useful. One of the other things in the GPRA Modernization Act was a requirement that for the agency priority goals, and there were about 85 of them, that they would be assessed on a quarterly basis, and that assessment would be posted to a public website, government-wide. It's called performance.gov, and anybody can go there and see what the performance of the agency priority goals, and then about 14 or 15 cross-agency priority goals. And so these are the kinds of approaches as to how this evolved. What was also interesting is philosophically, the whole system evolved from a strong focus on accountability of were goals and targets met to more of learning of why things weren't met, what needed to be done differently, how do we change our strategies? And so the system has evolved from a focus on agencies to a focus on programs to a focus on outcomes, from a shift from an emphasis on accountability to more of an emphasis internally learning. But the accountability and the performance websites, et cetera, still were all out there. The other thing that was interesting was that for the first time with the 2010 law is that there was stability in changing from one presidency to another. So the performance management system that was developed in the Modernization Act in 2010 was not changed or rethought by the Trump administration and has not changed or been rethought with the Biden administration. So some of the examples of cross-agency priority goals would be things like IT modernization initiatives, shared services, customer experience initiatives, and things like that. So that's been an evolution that has really had a lot of maturation over time. The other thing that was interesting is at the agency level, these quarterly data-driven, what they call performance stat meetings, looked at the progress of the agency level priority goals. And each agency had to designate a priority goal lead or team. And then there'd be things like the opioid epidemic, reducing injuries in coal mines, modernizing the veterans appeals process. And the other thing that was interesting was that the agencies were asked to do assessments of their overarching strategic objectives. So each agency's strategic plans had strategic goals, and then underneath that would be strategic objectives. And they were to annually assess the progress of their strategic objectives. And there's about 330 of those government-wide. And that is now a broader system that we've got. This is not moved down to the program level as well as one might think so far, but some of the data that's being developed is becoming more granular and more real time. So for example, there is a federal employee viewpoint survey that's done. Over 750,000 federal employees take that survey. It's granular and detailed enough to do assessments at 28,000 work units across the government. And so those are the kinds of things that are going on at the federal level. At the state and local level, what's interesting is the catalyst is not necessarily inside the government. The catalyst for change or for use of performance information is oftentimes in the nonprofit or the foundation world. So the Pew Charitable Trust has created an outcome focus, and they have been working with state governments to improve their focus on performance and accountability. There's also something called the Results First initiative on the use of evidence to begin to improve decision making. This is not happening necessarily state government-wide, but more in selected policy areas like correction or criminal justice or social services. And this is in part because some of the nonprofits or foundations are focused on those policy areas and are trying to introduce more of an outcome orientation in them. One state that has done a statewide effort is the state of Colorado. It began in 2010 with what it's called a Smart Government Act, and it gained traction in 2015 with the appointment of the first statewide chief performance officer who introduced things like Lean Six Sigma. They created to build a technical capacity, what they call the Peak Academy, I guess for the Denver Peaks or whatever, to train state workers on how to analyze and use data in their decisions. And it's driven their data dialogues with counties and their contractors. The current governor has a statewide performance dashboard that he set up so all citizens could see the progress of statewide initiatives. There's other states, New Mexico, Washington State, Utah, Virginia. It's not necessarily politically driven by Democrats or Republicans. These tends to be more of a state type culture. At the local level, the driver, again, the catalyst is out of a foundation. It's predominantly out of the Bloomberg Foundation. He created a Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University, and over the past 7 or 8 years, funded it with about nearly $100 million. And they are working with mid-sized, not big cities, but mid-sized cities to develop capacity to do analytics and look for outcomes and have good data and create processes which they call CityStat, or a way of systematically looking at progress of different priorities, et cetera. So has this sort of resulted in any kind of a difference? I think that it's kind of improved accountability for program performance at the federal level. It's improved organizational performance through use of things like balanced scorecard and the employee survey, and support for the decisions, budget decisions, but it's not necessarily drives or is tightly linked. It's more informing. At the federal level, at least, there's been a lot of resistance by the congressional committees of being told how to use performance information. They tend not to, but it is used in the formulation of budgets, and it's oftentimes used in the agencies for the execution of budgets. And it's also used to inform somewhat employee pay decisions, especially for senior executives, career senior executives. The movement is headed towards a greater use of accountability as a result of technology making data more readily available, with more frequent reporting and more granular. Instead of averages, they're looking at much more targeted things. So, and there's a series of federal laws in the US government that have made data collection and data analysis much more of mandatory thing. And we have not only the Modernization Act, there's the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, the Grant Reporting Efficiency Act, the Federal Program Inventory. So there's a lot of federal laws that are creating this notion of greater accountability, but they're not tied together. It sort of has to be done on the administrative side. The other is that it's more, the use in the budgeting process is greater largely at the state and local levels, particularly at the local level. Increased use of information to inform implementation decisions on what works and what doesn't. And that gets into the next movement that I'll be talking about related to evidence. And then it's also becoming useful, especially ironically at the local level, for predicting future trends. Is where do we want to be going? And then finally, it's increasing links in sharing administrative, statistical, and geographic data across agencies and levels of government. There's now many more data repositories, federal, state, and local. There's a federal data.gov, but a lot of states have this, and a lot of local governments are creating these. At the federal level, the federal data.gov repository has more than 250,000 shareable data sets. And this is and going to be increasing with something called the Federal Data Strategy to bring together more administrative data sets. So let's look at now the next movement that I'm calling data analytics and evidence-based policymaking. This draws upon disciplines from program evaluation, data analytics, and technology, and it's been popularized with something called Moneyball government, pay for success, evidence-based government, what works initiatives, results matter, a lot of different terms, but a lot of this all begins to tie back together. And it started, interestingly, in the Bush administration when they were doing the agency level, the programmatic level reviews of asking for evidence of these results. Are there any results that can be demonstrated out of the programs? And that began creating a demand for evidence at the agency level that hadn't existed before. It rose to prominence in the Obama administration and gained momentum through a number of nonprofits and foundations and advocacy groups. There was a law that was passed in 2018 called the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. And that law requires all agencies to develop learning agendas, which are basically strategic plans for how they're going to do program evaluation. And that kicks in full-time next year. What's interesting, though, is more is happening at the state and local level in this area. Now, at the federal level, the capacity building for evidence and data and creating new routines and a governance framework has resulted from a series of different laws. It started with, in the Obama administration, the Office of Management Budget, which is kind of like your Treasury Board, I guess, creating an evidence and innovation unit. And the deputy secretaries had a deputies committee that met and promoted the use of evidence and investments by agencies in evidence. And the Office of Management and Budget had guidance that offered additional funding for agency-developed initiatives. So the Obama administration sort of kickstarted it by providing funding and a lot of incentives to do this. The Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, which is in 2014, created standards to track contracts and subcontract data, funding data, all the way down to the subcontract level. There's a program management improvement officers council that was created. The chief evaluation officers and chief data officers and were created through this Evidence Act in 2019. There's a Grants Act that was created in 2019 to create standards and track grants, much like was in the Data Act for contracts. And then just in December of 2020, there was a Federal Program Inventory Act requiring an inventorying of all federal programs. And then there's a cross-agency goals that started under the GPRA Modernization Act in 2010, creating a federal data strategy, a 10-year vision of how federal data is going to be brought together and shared and for outcome-oriented grants. Some examples of federal evidence-based initiatives are tiered evidence grants, performance-based contracts, use of administrative waivers, what works clearinghouses for policy areas like education and criminal justice. A tiered evidence grant, for example, the U.S. Department of Education, its Education Innovation Research Program gives a little bit of money for a program that's never been tried before, a little bit more when there's evidence that there seems to be some possibilities of successful outcomes, and a lot more when something seems to be worthy of being replicated in other places. So at the federal level, this is beginning to pan out, and it's being embedded into a number of different federal laws as they're being reauthorized. They're in the billions of dollars. So it's beginning to catch fire. At the state level, again, Pew Charitable Trusts and MacArthur Foundation has provided money for at the state level. There's another nonprofit, it's called Results for America. That's a bipartisan initiative that's created standards that they are applying to states, and they showcase states that are best practices and annually recognizes them for the progress that they're being made. So it's an external recognition thing. And a 2019 survey by the National Association of State Budget Officers found 108 different state level initiatives in 44 states that are using data and evidence in decision-making in parts of the state governments. At the local level, the Bloomberg Foundation I mentioned earlier, this Johns Hopkins Center for Government Excellence, the initiative is called What Works Cities, started in 2015, and they created recently a certification program so cities can apply to be certified as having a good analytic structure for decision-making and informing outcomes. And it gets into all sorts of things, analyzing citizen complaints, streamlining procurement, resource allocation for clean streets or crime fighting. So it gets into the granular stuff. Now, is this making much of a difference? There's another nonprofit called the Data Foundation, and the head of it, Nick Hart, compiled a study describing like 20 specific cases where evidence influenced policymaking at the federal, state, and local levels. For example, the federal earned income tax credit over a 40-year lifespan synthesized dozens of evaluations to show that this particular policy tool boosts labor supply, reduces poverty, and contributes to long-term well-being. And this program is being expanded by the Congress. It was expanded in a number of years, and some states are creating their own versions of it. The evidence movement can be also characterized as being comprised of a lot of experimentation at all levels of government. More institutionalization at the federal and state levels, but a lot of experimentation in different policy areas, especially health and social services, and at the local level, corrections, criminal justice, etc. There seems to be a commitment to building evidence and analytic capacity at all levels. And interestingly, it's the COVID pandemic that has made the use of data something that people kind of understand. And it's become less of an abstract thing, and people can see how you can use data to drive decisions, etc. The other movement that is just beginning over the past few years is something called behavioral public administration or behavioral science movement. At the US level, at the federal level, there's no legal mandates around this. It's a lot of enthusiasm, but not a lot of statutory involvement. What's interesting is that the field of behavioral science may hold the answers to why seemingly well-designed programs and policies fail. The policymakers in a lot of programs assume that humans are rational, and when oftentimes they are not, and make choices that are counter to their own best interests. And so it's not just how you design a program that's rational, it's how do you design a program that works for people that aren't rational, but maybe predictably not rational. So it focuses less on institutional behavior and more on individual behaviors, such as how do you have people avoid poor choices and provide incentives to take certain actions. Concrete example is state of Ohio offering $1 million lottery for people to get their COVID shots. I thought that was an interesting use of federal aid money that they got, but this notion of how do you nudge citizens to kind of like do the right thing. At the federal level, this whole initiative sort of got prominence in the Obama administration when in 2015, the president signed an executive order creating something called the Social and Behavioral Science Team. And that was located in the White House, and they ran a series of pilot efforts. It was sort of modeled after something that was developed by the British government. They called it the Nudge Unit, after a book of that title, is how do you nudge people to do the right thing. And they're using it at the federal level to communicate with the recipients and change the way some programs are being administered. So for example, in our Social Security old age program, it's informing the public about when is the best time to claim your retirement benefits, or automatic enrollment and reduced lunch, school lunch program for low-income children. So you have better access. And the Defense Department is getting the soldiers to automatically enroll in a federal retirement plan rather than requiring them to make an active choice. So they have a lot of experiments that they've been developing to demonstrate the value of public administration's use of behavioral science. This office transitioned over to the General Services Administration, and they have an Office of Evaluation Sciences, and it offers basically consulting help to agencies to try some of these projects. And it's a multidisciplinary team that has behavioral science, psychologists, economists, political scientists, ethnographers, statisticians, and they work together to develop some interesting experiments and work with agencies on encouraging vaccination uptake rates and increasing retirement savings and stuff like that. At the state and local level, there's a lot of work that's being done with local universities and nonprofit foundations. Again, mostly these are pilots, but in places like the state of Pennsylvania, a university team worked with its State Department of Revenue to develop behavioral nudge prompts to reduce tax delinquencies, and by sending notices to small businesses. And they tested different kinds, whether handwritten notices or the message, the language of the message, et cetera. And they found that redesigning reminder letters increased owed taxes paid for, increased the payment of delinquent taxes by 13 to 22%. And they figured out if they scaled this to the full population, it would save about $29 million for the state government. So they're looking at this as ways of, in some cases, improving uptake of programs, in some cases also for saving things. And it's largely using A/B testing and things that are small, iterative, etc. City of Philadelphia launched a program in 2016. They found that they could get an increase in people participating in a program, that elderly to get their cheaper water rates. And they found that the best way to increase people opening the letters and taking advantage of the lower rates was the size of the envelope. So these tests aren't always necessarily intuitive and stuff. So is this making a difference? It looks like it's a powerful set of tools to improve the chances of successfully designing and implementing a policy or program. But there is, and it can be used in a wide range of policy areas, in financial investment or public health or transportation safety, environmental protection, food safety. And it's a different tool than the use of taxes or subsidies or regulation to influence social behavior. And it feels more voluntary for a lot of people than that. So this is something that is being actually at the federal level considered for legislation, something called the social determinants of health. It turns out that you can improve health not by health care or health insurance, but helping people make healthier choices in their lifestyles. And this is reducing obesity, smoking, alcohol abuse, et cetera. And so there's legislation that may actually improve the use of behavioral science in a broader area. So now what happens? The idea, at least in my head, is how do we bring these three different movements together to improve decision-making by policymakers? The performance movement may be able to improve accountability and foster learning, but it's typically seen as backward-looking and compliance-oriented. The evidence movement is helpful in determining programmatic outcomes and better informing choices in budget and policy, but it's being criticized as being too costly or slow and too focused on methodological issues. Behavioral public administration movement is more experimental, and people say that it's focused on micro changes. But if you begin bringing these together, they can sort of mutually reinforce each other at different stages of the policy and the implementation process. The key, I think, is not how do you create and stand these up separately, but how do you begin weaving these into existing routine administrative process, the budget and financial process, the personnel process, the program management process, risk process, contract and grants management, and regulatory oversight. It's how do we take these different tools and approaches and begin weaving them into existing professional processes that exist, and begin reducing the barriers among the different professional domains here that are involved. So what I'd like to conclude is that the US evolution in each of these three areas doesn't seem to be quite as neatly structured, at least as I have seen the Canadian approach. But it does give agencies and our government some latitude to try new approaches and to innovate for their missions. Scale may matter. We have an agency, the Department of Veterans Affairs, that has 413,000 employees, which is much larger than your entire civil service. So you may have the ability to be more agile than we are in the US government simply because of the scale. The thing that I have always admired about the Canadian approach is you're always trying to be more holistic than the US approach, whereas we tend to be much more focused and fragmented in some things. The final slide is the IBM Center has done a number of reports that I think may be interesting to you to follow up on. And I think that you'll get these slides afterwards. I'll make sure I get them posted and leave it up to them. So Allison, I think I talked a little longer than we originally talked about, but going to continue the conversation? How do you want to go here? There we go.
Well, I have to say, John, generally that any one of those bullets would have merited an in-depth presentation on its own. That's fabulous. I think you've given us a terrific overview, and you've managed to cover something like 30 years or 40 years or whatever length in a very short period of time. So bravo. We have about 20 minutes left before the break. We've received a couple of questions,
Okay.
but primarily on the Canadian context. And those I'm going to suggest we collect and refer to the appropriate officials at Treasury Board Secretariat. In the meantime, if our conference participants have specific questions for John on the US or international, please put them in the Q&A session box. And let me just ask you, while we're waiting for those, if you could elaborate a little bit on what you did and who you spoke with when you were up in Canada, and what impressions you left with. I know you touched on that briefly at the beginning.
Yeah, that was probably about 30 years ago,
Okay.
1991. I can't remember the names, but I can remember faces. And I met with, obviously, folks, because I was working at the time for our National Audit Office. I met with folks from your National Audit Office. Actually, Maria Baradas was probably there at the time. And met with folks from your Treasury Board, and also visited with a number of agencies. One of the things that I did as I was visiting from country to country is that I chose different policy areas. So customs and housing, et cetera. And it was fascinating to find that there were greater commonalities within the policy area across countries than there were within each country. And so, for example, if I went to Customs Service, they were always organized, whichever country we were in, they always had nameplates at the table. And you visit the housing agency, and they didn't know the other people that were their colleagues that were in the same room, or people didn't have a key to the room or something, you know. So it was, I just found it humorous that the kinds of people that gravitate to certain disciplines have a lot more commonalities than there are in the government. The one thing I found intriguing in the Canadian approach, at least at the time, was the effort to standardize, to create standardized measures, to create standardized approaches. And what we saw in the US is we purposely did not try to standardize because we were afraid that if we standardized, it may be useful to the people that see the standardized reports, but may never be useful to the people that would wind up needing to use information. And so there's always been a reluctance in the US level of trying to standardize between departments. And the Congress sometimes is trying to drive standardization, but it's not like they would ever use it, because we have 200 committees and subcommittees in our Congress, and they don't talk to each other. And so why would standardizing help any of them? So
can you elaborate a little bit on the plans, if any, in the US to measure the results of the COVID funding? Is there any plan or any traction on that?
There's in the various laws that were passed over the past year that basically appropriate $5 trillion. Okay, our annual budget is like $1.5 trillion. So this is $5 trillion dumped on top of the existing spendings, which is just unbelievably phenomenal amount of money. Is that there was money that was set aside for auditors, and not a lot of money necessarily set aside for evaluation. But the auditors, there's a government-wide website, and all the auditors across the government from each agency, and what we call them inspectors general, are working together on a task force to track where the money is going, but not necessarily too much the impact. There has been the creation inside the executive branch of an implementation task force, and there's not a lot of publicity about what they're doing. There's somebody that was appointed by the president to be overall in charge, there's not much news out. And in fact, one of the things that I'm doing is I chair for our National Academy for Public Administration a monthly forum on what's going on in the government. And next month, I'm trying to recruit the people that are working on this shadowy task force to come and explain sort of what it's doing. I think that there's a parallel. Well, there's a parallel to what went on in 2009 when Biden was put in charge of the implementation of the Recovery Act, and that was a mere 800 billion at the time. Was stunning amount of money. This is like more than quintuple the stunning amount of money. So my guess is he has in his head the implementation strategy that was used then, and he has designated Gene Sperling, who had worked in the Clinton and the Obama administration at very high levels in the White House, as being in charge. And so that'll be an interesting thing to see how that evolves.
I think we'll have to keep track of that, because I'm sure there's lessons learned for us Canadians on, one of the things that's top of mind, of course, is how do you get the money out of the door with the least amount of a risk? And so that's the flip side of the performance measurement question, which I think one of our folks and the participants has. But before we get that, one last question, and that is, if you had to give Canada 3 lessons based on your experience over the years, what would they be? And just to give you a bit of insight, we're really moving into your movement too as well, the data analytics and using that for evidence-based policy and program making. And we're having trouble moving from the theory to the practice on that. And so how do we get traction, and how do we build the processes, and how do we do data collection is a huge issue for us in terms of building that capacity. So I'll leave you with that thought, but just generally, what are the top 3 lessons you think we should keep in mind?
Well, one of the things is observing the Canadian system from a distance. The impression that it gives me is that there is a strong focus on accountability. And the more emphasis you place on accountability, the less innovation you're going to have. And the more it's going to be, let's cover it with paperwork and compliance. And there was a shift that occurred in our system, and both performance and it was part of the evaluation evidence movement of how do we turn this into a curiosity-driven learning experience. And so the idea is, let's not focus on targets. Let's focus on progress.
Okay.
And if there isn't progress, ask questions. And what does it need to be done differently? So it becomes more of an iterative learning process as opposed to a linear process. So that's one of this, shifting from an emphasis on accountability, which still needs to happen, but more of an emphasis on learning. And there is a framework for doing that in the US, which we call performance stat, and it's described in one of the documents that I have and the appendix and the resources say. The second is that the averages don't matter. If you focus on average, and then what you're doing is you're missing out a lot on the tails. And this really, for us, gets into the social equity and stuff like that, is that if an agency has a score of 10 or whatever, that the sub-agency units, some may have a 1 and somebody may have a 20. And what you really want to do is focus on where the problems are, and you can't see them when you average things out. You really need to look at much more granular data, and the data needs to be more real time, because when data are a year old, managers will always deny that it has any relevance, even if it's still relevant, because it's a year old. And so this notion of real time and granular and putting it into the hands into the hands of people on the front line, the most. So for example, we have these little touch pads in our immigration offices, are happy, glad, whatever buttons, red, green, and yellow, or are you happy with what you saw today? And the managers in the office will be able to see real time what's going on out there in the line. And so, and with our TSA guards on the airports and stuff. So sometimes you really need to be able to track data and use it at the frontline level as much as possible. And the
Okay.
third thing is look at multiple sources of data. Don't rely on simply. So some of it may be tactical data, some of it may be strategic data, some of it may be perception data, but being multi-source and multidisciplinary is really important. And it's hard to bring these people together to talk to each other because they each feel that they have the answer, but bringing them together, and the idea is not to have each of them go separately to the boss and have the boss synthesize it, but have them synthesize it before they go to the boss. So this notion of multi-source, multidisciplinary is important. I just think that some of the things that we've learned watching the Canadians is the things that have happened in your government around the use of creating foresight mechanisms, et cetera. So
Yes.
you're still inspiring us in the US.
Well, thank you, John. I believe that there's a couple of questions from the audience, so I'll turn it over to Nadine if she is there to pick up from here, and then
Oh,
I'll be
great.
back.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Allison, and thank you, John, for informing us a lot about what's been happening in the US over a number of years and how you've interacted and seen the Canadian perspective. We have a number of questions from the audience, and so I'm going to try and group these together sort of thematically if I can.
Okay.
So touching on the last thing you just said, I think this is a good one to start with, is just like the US, Canadian parliamentarians do not often pay much attention to performance reporting. Why do you think this is the case? And is there something we can do to change that?
They do care, but they care about it not in the abstract. So if you bring them a report with data in it, they can't relate to it. Typically, politicians, legislators are story driven. So you have to be able to not just use random anecdotes, but anecdotes that illustrate a trend or that illustrate a phenomena that's going on. So part of this is how do you tell the story? And what we've found is that our legislators relate to stories. They don't read data reports. And so part of this is how do you tell compelling stories that are data anchored in data that help explain that. Sometimes, as we're now moving from data tables to graphics and maps and stuff, and that really helps. The other is to allow them to play with the data in some ways. So if you give them options to play with maps or stuff, it almost like gamifies it in a way that captures their imaginations and stuff. So those are a couple of things that we're finding that helps tie it back.
Thank you. That actually touches on another one that I'm curious to have your perspective on. So the late US Senator Patrick Moynihan is quoted as saying that you are entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. That seems to have changed in the US with recent changes and things. As an empiricist seeking to encourage results management, how do you deal with that? How do you, those compelling stories may not be as factually based as a graph, for example. How would you deal with that?
Well, there are different facts that are available, and some people focus on some facts over other facts. And what's interesting, especially in the program evaluation world, is it's like they're more than an economist on the one hand and on the other. They always have like 4 or 5 different, well, yeah, but here's this constraint and here's that. Is how is it that you emphasize a particular trend or something, and also give credence to countervailing factors, et cetera. And a lot of this will get back into behavioral science, is that people are looking for facts that reinforce an existing pre-held perception that you have. So there's a lot of, what it takes is somebody that is very good at data and very clear at being able to explain things. I thought it was funny the other day, the president, Biden, had a meeting with Janet Ledinka, who's his chief science advisor for climate change. And he stopped her during a presentation. He says, wait a minute, are you a scientist? And she says, yes. He says, well, I understood what you said. And so part of this is, how do you convey information and the facts? And there will be different kinds of facts, and it's how do you frame them in a way that's understandable and that convinces people.
So I think we've been talking more from a sort of an individual perspective, or maybe as a leader. Now there's a couple of questions around congressional committees and how, so I'll quote it. So in your speaking notes, when you were talking, you were saying that that congressional committees tended not to be involved in performance management and reporting, for example, through the budgeting process. And also there's another piece to that, the GAO, sorry, I don't know that acronym, I'm assuming it's American.
That's a government accountability office. Yeah.
Okay. The GAO's review of agency performance information, which is provided to the congressional committees, tends not to be used by those committees. So why are those the cases if those committees, if you can get through to the individual, can you get to a point where committees are making those decisions based on that information?
Sometimes. Again, it's kind of idiosyncratic between the different committees and the dynamics there. This is not that much different at the state level either, with state legislators. And there's been a lot of studies as to what's going on, and part of it is just, that's the way legislators are, but you can use evidence and data in the budget preparation and decision process in advance of the legislators, and you can use it in the implementation process afterwards. So you may have, it's not like the performance system doesn't work, but segments of the performance system are weaker than others. What's also interesting is that when we have something called the Congressional Research Service, which is like a research arm of Congress working for the Library of Congress. And they looked at committee use of performance information, and it turns out they didn't pull out performance reports. They were referring to performance information that they got anecdotally or through multiple sources. So it's not like they don't use performance information, but they seem to look for it on their own as opposed to the information that's actually given to them. In the Bush administration, they wanted to integrate the performance information into the budget. And the appropriators say, no, put it in the back of the budget so it's easier for us to tear off and throw away. So, it's just, that's the way they seem to think. And it's not like you're going to change their behavior, but as, for example, we're beginning to see these laws like the Determinants of Social Health Accelerator Act and some of these other laws, they're actually beginning to embed this into law. And it's not coming from the executive branch, it's coming from the nonprofit advocacy groups, such as Results for America and others that are nonpartisan, and they're getting like a 1% set aside in the Department of Housing and Urban Development budget for evaluation, or they're getting money that is for a competitive grant, that you'll get a grant recipient, whether it's state or local government, gets more money if they will invest in evaluation as a part of their process. So they're beginning to embed these things in, but it's a very idiosyncratic thing. It's not like there's this grand policy. So it's slow.
It was a great segue because one of the questions is actually about what is going on from your perspective in private sector or not-for-profit sector in performance measurement.
Yeah, well, I worked on reinventing government back in the 90s, and there was never an external group that was sort of like the advocate for reinventing government. And what I found interesting is with the evolution of the Evidence Act and evidence movement is that you have Results for America, you have Pew Charitable Trust with Results First, you have the Data Foundation. There's a lot of these nonprofit and advocacy groups, think tanks that are cropping up that are nonpartisan, that are advocating the use of evidence and data. and partly driven, like the Data Foundation has an auxiliary group called the Data Coalition, and it's comprised of companies that would benefit from the government collecting data, like cloud IT providers and places like that, that will support, because it creates a demand drive for their products. And so they are supporting the Data Foundation, which in turn promoted the passage of the Evidence Act. And so we're beginning for the first time to see the nonprofit and the foundation world see that the monies that are being used more effectively, right? And it's not the heritage foundations or the Cato Foundation, those that are partisan. It's the nonprofit ones that are driving a lot of this behavior. And so they're able to get people on board. And the Bloomberg Foundation, they've put in almost $100 million over the past 7 or 8 years into helping cities improve their use of data and their decision making. So there's some phenomenal, I don't know what's going on in the water here, but it's good. So
that's good to hear, because I think many of the practitioners that are in this webinar, or whatever we're calling it, symposium, will appreciate that there is a future in this area. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if you can keep it kind of brief, because I know Allison wants to wrap up. But this is an important one. In considering the behavioral aspects of program outcomes, do you integrate risks into the model? For example, the risk that public adoption of a program may be below target for any number of reasons beyond the control of the program.
Yeah, well, the whole use of behavioral science is still a growing area, and it requires the use of testing, which means some people get it and some people don't. And so then there's a fear of, are we treating people equitably? Because the only way you can test it is not treat people equitably. And so this notion of how can you make sure that somebody goes hungry and the other person gets fed or something. So there's a concern about using that, but in a way, if you can do it in short-term, quick things, as opposed to things that take 20 years to show evidence. And that's where the use of administrative data comes in, because administrative data can provide stuff that time series data used to require. You used to have to set aside monies to track people over a period of decades or whatever to see what the outcome of the program is. Administrative data sometimes can serve as a surrogate for that. So there's ways of doing it, but yeah, it's not a cut and dry and simple little thing.
Okay, I think that's, I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but those are the ones that people had, additional people had voiced that they wanted to hear an answer to. So I'm gonna turn it back to Allison to wrap up.
Oh, and just if people want to continue the conversation, they can go through Allison and reach me and stuff. So I'm more than glad to be helpful.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Nadine. Actually, I was going to suggest that if there are any more questions, send them to, I guess, send them to me directly. It's allison1l.taylor@live.com. I will coordinate with John on answering those. I have a few myself, which I may throw in there as well. And there may be some way of doing a post-conference follow-up, John, if you're willing, to maybe chat around those questions, because there's so much there and we'd like to take advantage of it, quite frankly, if we could. You've been absolutely fabulous, and thank you for your time today and all your insights. I know that I say this on behalf of participants in PPX. It is very much appreciated that you took the time today and shared your thoughts and insights over the course of your career. So from us to you, thank you so much. And I'll turn it back to PPX.
Okay, take care.